Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe and share. Help build my channel and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. Most people grow up with a clear mental image of ancient Britain, painted savages in animal skins, primitive tribes huddled in mud huts, and a barbaric culture that only found civilization through Roman conquest. This narrative has become so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that questioning it seems almost absurd. Yet a growing body of evidence suggests this entire historical framework may be fundamentally wrong. What if, far from being backward barbarians, the ancient Britons had thriving cities, sophisticated art, international trade networks, and a complex spiritual tradition that eagerly embraced early Christianity decades before Rome itself? The challenge of understanding ancient British history begins with language barriers that have persisted for centuries. Historians have relied almost exclusively on Greek and Latin sources when studying ancient Britain, completely ignoring indigenous British languages like early Cymric, the ancestor of modern Welsh. This creates a massive disconnect, the equivalent of trying to understand Japanese culture through exclusively Spanish and Portuguese texts. Translation problems compound as inconsistent practices between languages created historical confusion. Without consulting native Briton or Gaulish linguistic contexts, historians missed crucial cultural nuances that would have provided a completely different picture of ancient British society. This neglect of indigenous languages has resulted in systematic misrepresentation of Britain's ancient past. When inconvenient historical records couldn't be explained away, they were simply relegated to mythology, significant periods dismissed as mere legend despite substantial documentation. This creates a historical paradox where available evidence contradicts the accepted narrative, yet the inaccurate perspective persists with remarkable tenacity across generations of scholarship. The evidence suggests intentional misrepresentation, not simply academic oversight. What's particularly striking is that we're not lacking historical sources about ancient Britain, we're drowning in them. Classical testimonies from Romans and Greeks about British culture have been systematically overlooked. Indigenous British records like the early triads and Welsh bardic traditions contain significant historical information that contradicts conventional positions, yet remain unused by mainstream historians. Institutional repositories are filled with evidence, extensive collections in the British Museum Library, church records, and thousands of Cymric triads preserved in the Vatican Library. These contain documentation of early British Christian activities, yet they're ignored in favor of the established narrative of primitive painted savages awaiting Roman civilization. What's particularly revealing is that even Britain's supposed enemies provided accounts that contradict this savage portrayal. Roman and Greek observers frequently acknowledged advanced British cultural systems in their writings. Julius Caesar himself expressed admiration for British culture after his military campaign in 55 BCE, recognizing their character, ethical standards, and commercial ingenuity. Caesar was amazed by the numerous populous British cities and their advanced architecture. He documented universities and centers of learning, acknowledging British intellectual traditions. He noted the substantial population throughout England, indicating successful agriculture and societal organization. Most significantly, Roman records recognized the spiritual sophistication of pre-Christian Britons, particularly their belief in the immortality of the soul, a theological concept that aligned closely with early Christian teachings. If Britain was indeed so advanced before Roman contact, the question naturally arises, where did this civilization come from? Archaeological and historical evidence traces clear Celtic migrations across Europe. Classical records document Cimmerian or Keltoi people moving westward, eventually reaching Britain. Modern ethnological research has confirmed these migration patterns, showing cultural continuity from Eastern origins all the way to the British Isles. Material culture connections can be traced from the Crimea to Britain, with archaeological continuity comparable to other established ancient civilizations. The prophet Isaiah even directly addresses inhabitants of the Isles in biblical texts, suggesting Britain's significance was recognized in ancient Jewish writings, a connection that becomes particularly important when considering early Christian missions to Britain. Britons were recognized even by their Roman conquerors as inventors of sophisticated enameling techniques, a metalworking process requiring advanced material understanding that Romans themselves had not mastered. Museums today hold remarkably preserved artifacts like the Glastonbury Bowl, in perfect condition after 2 millennia, and the Desborough Mirror, demonstrating metallurgical knowledge far beyond what would be expected from primitive people. What's most remarkable is that the designs actually surpassed the Greek prototypes in sophistication, achieving exceptional balance in symmetrical design and superior handling of negative space in composition. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of this alternative historical narrative concerns early Christianity in Britain. Evidence suggests Christianity arrived in Britain decades before it was established in Rome itself, coming directly from the disciples rather than through Roman channels of influence. Early British Christians were given a distinctive designation in historical records, Culdi, rather than simply being called Christians. This term had Celtic British linguistic origins, interpreted variously as certain strangers, or Celeda, meaning servant of the Lord. Both interpretations fit the context of the first missionaries to reach Britain's shores with a message that was both foreign and divine. British historical records document several early Culdi missionaries, including Joseph of Arimathea and his 12 companions, along with other disciples mentioned in British triads, Paul, Peter, Lazarus, Simon Zelotes, and Aristobulus among others. The term, Culdi, was exclusively associated with British Christian missions, not used in other Celtic regions including Gaul, indicating a uniquely British Christian development independent of continental influence. Over time, the term evolved to take on greater ecclesiastical significance, with the Culdi Church considered the original Church of Christ in Britain. The designation continued for centuries. It was still in use at St. Peter's, York until 936 CE, and York canons were documented as Culdis during Henry II's reign. There was even an Irish county bearing the Culdi name into the 17th century, demonstrating the remarkable persistence of this distinctive Christian tradition. A common objection to the possibility of first-century Christian missions to Britain centers on language barriers. How could Palestinian Jews possibly communicate with Celtic Britons? This objection misunderstands the multilingual context of both the first-century Mediterranean and ancient Britain. The first-century Mediterranean was highly multilingual. While Greek dominated as the lingua franca throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Aramaic and Hebrew were primarily used among Judeans. Roman Palestine was a multilingual province where educated residents would commonly know Greek, Hebrew, and Latin as a matter of practical necessity in a cosmopolitan region. Jesus himself was likely multilingual, probably fluent in Aramaic and Hebrew as regional languages, with knowledge of Greek for commerce and possibly Latin as the administrative language. Some traditional accounts even suggest knowledge of Celtic language among his circle, not implausible given the extensive trade networks connecting the Mediterranean with the British Isles. Greek language knowledge predated Christ's era in ancient Britain by centuries. Commercial relationships with Phoenicians and Greek tin merchants facilitated language exposure through trade. Julius Caesar documented Druids using Greek script for commerce, evidence of international connections and sophisticated trade networks that made Britain far less isolated than conventional history suggests. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament created at Alexandria in 283 BCE, had made biblical texts accessible throughout the Greek-speaking world, including trading centers in Britain. This multilingual context meant that early Christian missionaries would have found communities capable of understanding their message without insurmountable language barriers. The Celtic language itself holds fascinating clues to ancient connections that may have facilitated early Christian mission work. Contemporary philological research recognizes Celtic, Cymric as possibly the oldest living European language with remarkable continuity over thousands of years. Linguistic analysis has revealed root word similarities between Celtic and ancient Hebrew, suggesting early cultural or ethnic connections that predate Christian missions. What's particularly interesting is that while modern Hebrew is a reconstructed classical language, Celtic languages have maintained living status for thousands of years. Welsh, Cornish, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Breton have all preserved elements of this ancient tongue. Modern Celtic language Bibles, publications, and even newspapers demonstrate this remarkable continuity through centuries of cultural evolution. This linguistic evidence completely reframes our understanding of early British Christianity. Rather than Christianity arriving with Roman occupation and slowly spreading to barbaric natives, the evidence suggests Britain eagerly embraced Christian teachings brought by the earliest disciples. The sophisticated spiritual traditions already established in Britain, particularly their belief in the immortality of the soul, created fertile ground for Christian teachings that aligned with existing theological concepts. This explains why Christian communities in Britain often maintained distinctive practices that differed from Roman Christianity in later centuries. These weren't deviations from Roman tradition, they were independent traditions with direct connections to the original apostles, maintaining practices that in some cases may have been closer to the earliest church than those that evolved in Rome. Academic resistance to these compelling alternative histories stems from several factors. There's simple academic inertia, established narratives become entrenched and resistant to change regardless of contradictory evidence. Specialized academic silos create further barriers. Archaeologists, linguists, religious historians, and classicists rarely collaborate effectively on these interdisciplinary questions that require multiple perspectives. More problematically, there's been a systematic Roman-centric view of European history that privileges certain narratives while marginalizing others. Indigenous British perspectives have been systematically devalued, while Roman accounts have been elevated as the definitive historical record despite clear biases and limitations. The portrayal of pre-Roman Britain as savage and uncivilized served political purposes throughout history, justifying Roman conquest, later Norman conquest, and even British imperial expansion by establishing a precedent that civilized nations have the right to conquer barbaric ones. Acknowledging sophisticated pre-Roman British civilization and early Christian presence disrupts these convenient narratives that have shaped European self-understanding for centuries. The good news is that interdisciplinary approaches are finally starting to break down these barriers. Archaeological discoveries, linguistic analysis, and historical record examination are converging to create a much more complex and fascinating picture of ancient Britain than conventional history has allowed. This emerging understanding fundamentally challenges the Rome-centered narrative of Christianity's spread through Europe. If Britain received Christian teachings directly from disciples like Joseph of Arimathea decades before Rome fully embraced the faith, it suggests multiple independent trajectories of early Christianity rather than a single authorized Roman version that spread outward through imperial channels. This helps explain the distinctive characteristics of Celtic Christianity that persisted for centuries. The story of ancient Britain reminds us that history is always written from particular perspectives, privileging certain voices while silencing others. By expanding our sources, paying attention to indigenous voices, and approaching the past with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions, we open ourselves to a much richer and more complex understanding of our shared human story, one where Britain wasn't a primitive backwater awaiting Roman civilization, but a sophisticated culture that embraced Christianity from its earliest days through direct connection with the disciples themselves. Ancient Britain was not what most people imagine. Far from being a land of primitive tribes painting themselves blue and living in mud huts, pre-Roman Britain was a sophisticated civilization that participated in global trade networks spanning thousands of miles. This hidden history reveals an ancient British society that traded with King Solomon, conducted complex metallurgical operations, and was so valuable to Mediterranean powers that Phoenician captains would deliberately sink their own ships rather than reveal the sea routes to these resource-rich islands. The story of ancient Britain's tin industry and its connections to the Phoenician maritime empire offers a compelling case for rewriting our understanding of European prehistory. This narrative challenges conventional wisdom about who possessed advanced technology, who influenced whom, and which civilizations held economic power in the ancient world. The historical significance of Britain's tin industry stretches back far earlier than most people realize. Classical historians provide consistent documentation of British tin mining and trade starting at least 2,500 years ago. Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, made some of the earliest major references to an already well-established British tin trade. His accounts described commercial networks that had clearly been operating for generations, recognizing Britain as a primary global source for this crucial metal. A century later, the Greek explorer Pytheas ventured to Britain around 353 BCE and documented the sophisticated mining operations he witnessed. His observations detailed extraction techniques, processing methods, and the social organization that supported these industrial activities. These weren't primitive efforts but systematized operations that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge. Aristotle himself acknowledged the strategic importance of British tin in his writings around 350 BCE. By 150 BCE, the historian Polybius was providing detailed accounts of the transportation routes that carried British tin across Europe, documenting the trade relationships that had developed and the economic importance of British resources to Mediterranean economies. Other significant chroniclers like Diodorus Siculus and Posidonius expanded on these accounts, offering extensive descriptions of British mining communities, documenting their processing and transportation methods, and providing insights into the socio-economic structures that supported this industry. Their writings consistently portrayed the British not as barbarians but as skilled producers with established trade systems. The historical timeline reaches back even further than these classical accounts suggest. Compelling evidence indicates that tin from Cornwall was used in the construction of Solomon's Temple around 1005 BCE. This places British international trade connections at least 1,000 years before the Roman invasion. Historian Creasy documented the use of British sources for Solomon's Temple adornments, illustrating both the scale of extraction operations required and the economic significance of this royal commission. This ancient British Mediterranean connection wasn't simply a matter of raw material export. It facilitated cultural exchange, technological transfer, and linguistic influences that flowed in both directions. The relationship wasn't one of a civilized Mediterranean exploiting primitive island resources but rather a sophisticated commercial partnership between developed societies. The Spanish tin mining industry provides further context for understanding Britain's historical prominence. Julius Caesar's own account from around 50 BC observed the Talavera tin mine while recognizing the historical precedence and superiority of British mining operations. The Cornwall-Spanish mining connection was so strong that historical records show migration of Cornish mining expertise to Spain, with British specialists serving as instructors, technical advisors, and mining superintendents. At the center of this international tin trade were the Phoenicians, whose maritime trade empire created the crucial link between Britain and the Mediterranean world. Their specialized vessels, known as the ships of Tarshish, in both biblical and historical records, were pioneers in the transportation of tin across vast distances. The Phoenicians established remarkable dominance in Mediterranean shipping through strategic deployment of their large fleets, naval military capabilities that protected their trade routes, and sophisticated systems of port control and access regulations. Their commercial operation was the ancient equivalent of a global shipping monopoly that connected distant resource providers with wealthy markets. Perhaps most fascinating are the extreme protective measures Phoenicians employed to maintain their trade advantages. According to the Greek geographer Strabo, who died around 25 CE, Phoenician captains would deliberately wreck their own ships if they suspected they were being followed by potential competitors. Rather than reveal the secret sea routes to Britain's valuable tin deposits, they would sacrifice both vessel and cargo. This wasn't simple paranoia but calculated economic strategy. The Phoenician treasury maintained systems to reimburse captains who made such sacrifices, recognizing that preserving their trade monopoly was more valuable than individual shipments. These extreme security measures included false maritime route documentation, disinformation campaigns about the sources of tin, and highly restricted access to navigational knowledge. The Phoenician base of operations for this secretive Atlantic trade network was established in Cadiz, which served as the gateway between the Mediterranean and the mysterious resource-rich lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The technological and cultural sophistication of ancient Britain directly contradicts the common, barbarian, narrative. Classical writers consistently portrayed British society, particularly in the tin-producing regions of Cornwall and Devon, as civilized, organized, and technologically advanced. Recurring references to British friendliness in these accounts highlight their established diplomatic relations with foreign traders and contrast sharply with the hostile encounters Mediterranean travelers experienced in truly undeveloped regions. The metallurgical capabilities of ancient Britons required extensive scientific knowledge and technological skill. Tin extraction alone demanded sophisticated mining techniques, precise ore identification capabilities, and deep geological understanding. Even more impressive was their mastery of lead mining, which presents greater technical challenges than tin extraction. These operations weren't crude endeavors but reflected technical innovations and environmental adaptations developed over generations. Some scholars have even proposed the theory that the Bronze Age itself may have originated in Britain, not the Near East as commonly believed. With tin serving as the critical component in bronze alloys and evidence of very early bronze production in Britain, the technological dissemination may have flowed from the British Isles outward rather than the reverse. While archaeological debates continue, the timeline of bronze development increasingly supports earlier British participation than previously acknowledged. Linguistic evidence further challenges the barbarian narrative. British language development shows Hebrew-influenced foundations, Greek language familiarity, and sophisticated term creation capabilities. Hebrew place names scattered throughout Britain provide cultural historical evidence of ancient connections, with the geographical distribution, etymological roots, and preservation through successive cultural waves suggesting deep and lasting influences from the Eastern Mediterranean. One particularly intriguing thread in this historical tapestry involves Joseph of Arimathea's connection to the British tin industry. Folk traditions preserved in oral histories, poetic fragments, and miners' traditional songs consistently reference Joseph's involvement in the tin trade. Occupational folklore in mining communities includes traditional slogans like, "Joseph was a tin man," and "Joseph was in the tin trade," which appear in ceremonial contexts and show distinct geographic distribution patterns connected to historical mining regions. The traditions raise fascinating possibilities about his economic role as a merchant, investor, or technical advisor in the British tin industry. This fascinating history links early Christianity and British mining communities. The Celtic peoples who inhabited Britain have their own complex history that challenges conventional understanding. The very term, Celtic, evolved linguistically from earlier forms, Cimmerian to Cymry to Cymry to Celtoi to Celt, before reaching its modern usage. Regional variations developed across Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and France, with distinct terms like Celts, Celts, Gaels, and Gauls, emerging in different areas while reflecting a common heritage. The renowned French historian François Guizot supported this view in his influential Histoire de la civilisation en France, identifying the Gauls and Celts as the primary inhabitants of what would become France. The geographical relationship between Britain and continental Europe provides the final piece of this historical puzzle. Geological evidence confirms that Britain was once physically connected to the European mainland before rising sea levels separated them. Even after this separation, evidence of continued close contact appears in sources like the Druidic Triads, which reference a Gaulish bishop crossing to Britain on what was described as a plank bridge. These references suggest that communication between the mainland and the islands remained regular and important throughout ancient times. This revised understanding of ancient Britain has profound implications for historical interpretation. It requires a reassessment of the British historical timeline, recalibrating the economic importance of the islands in global trade, and recognizing cultural achievements that predated Roman influence by centuries. Rather than isolated primitives awaiting civilization, pre-Roman Britons appear as sophisticated participants in international networks of commerce, technology, and cultural exchange. This reframing challenges historians to employ more comprehensive methodological approaches that integrate multiple evidence types, documentary sources, archaeological findings, linguistic analysis, and oral traditions, while bringing interdisciplinary perspectives from geology, metallurgy, maritime archaeology, and religious history. Perhaps most importantly, it demands critical assessment of the biases inherent in classical sources, particularly those written from Roman and Greek perspectives or influenced by economic competitor agendas. The story of ancient Britain's sophisticated tin industry and its connection to Phoenician maritime trade represents one of history's most fascinating yet overlooked chapters. It reminds us that historical narratives are constantly evolving as new evidence emerges and old assumptions are challenged. By reconsidering what we thought we knew about ancient Britain, we open the door to a richer, more accurate understanding of European prehistory and the complex global connections that shaped human civilization long before the modern era. The forgotten stories that shaped our world often lie buried beneath layers of commonly accepted history. Today's episode of Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions uncovers one such narrative, a story so profound it challenges everything most people understand about British identity. What if the very name, British, held a secret meaning connecting to ancient Hebrew traditions? What if a people called the Cimmerians were the key to understanding the complex tapestry of British history? This is the story of one of history's most fascinating identity transformations, how a nomadic people journeyed to the western edges of Europe, settled in what we now call the British Isles, and underwent such a complete reinvention that their original name has been all but erased from popular history. The Cimmerians were a nomadic people who, through generations of migration, eventually reached what Roman writers would later call the Isles of the West. These weren't casual wanderers but carriers of distinct cultural and religious practices that would leave an indelible mark on the islands they settled. The Cimmerian migration to what we now call the British Isles represents one of the most significant yet understudied population movements in ancient European history. These weren't small bands of travelers, this was a substantial migration that fundamentally shaped the ethnic and cultural landscape of these islands. The journey from nomadic existence to settled life marked the beginning of a remarkable transformation. Over time, these settlers underwent a fascinating identity evolution. They gradually abandoned their original racial designation, Cimmerian, and adopted a completely new identifier that had no relation to their ethnic origin. They became known as the British. What's particularly interesting is that this wasn't a name imposed on them by conquerors. It stands as a remarkable case study in collective identity transformation. The etymology of British itself holds a key to understanding this transformation, and it takes scholarship in an unexpected direction. The name, British, appears to have Hebrew language origins, connecting to the ancient relationship between Hebrew and Old Cymric languages. When breaking down the term, researchers have found something remarkable. The term, British, is actually a compound of two Hebrew elements, berith, meaning covenant, and ish, the word for people or men. Together, they create Berithish, literally, covenant people. This linguistic connection raises fascinating questions about the religious and cultural identity of these early settlers. What's even more interesting is how the geographical designation evolved. When combined with an, a term denoting land, it produces Britain, literally meaning covenant land. This isn't just a place name, it's a theological statement. These Cimmerians weren't just adopting a new name, they were embracing a profound theological identity. They saw themselves as a covenant people inhabiting a covenant land. This framing would later take on new dimensions with the arrival of Christianity, where they reinterpreted themselves as consecrated people. Archaeological and historical records reveal that the Cimmerians maintained distinctive ceremonial behaviors centered around replicas of the Ark of the Covenant. These weren't casual religious practices, they were central to their identity. Foreign chroniclers often remarked on these unusual practices. What's particularly striking is how consistent these accounts are across centuries and from different observers. These weren't isolated incidents but established traditions that reflected deep cultural commitments. Several prominent scholars have documented the parallels between Cimmerian faith and Hebrew traditions. Sir Norman Lockyer found architectural connections between Stonehenge and ancient Near Eastern structures. Edward Davies identified ritual similarities between Druidic and Hebrew practices. William Stukeley's systematic analysis provided archaeological evidence supporting patriarchal connections between these seemingly disparate traditions. These weren't marginal academic theories but well-documented observations based on physical evidence and historical accounts. Primary historical sources also support these connections. Procopius of Caesarea, writing around 530 AD during the Gothic Wars, specifically referenced monotheistic beliefs among the people of these islands. Even earlier, Julius Caesar's ethnographic observations from 54 BC noted religious practices that stood apart from those of continental Celtic peoples. These historical accounts reveal a theological framework with distinctly monotheistic elements within what is often simplistically called Druidic tradition. The Cimmerians believed in a supreme deity, had a developed concept of soul immortality, and practiced a virtue-centered approach to spiritual development that shaped their social organization and ethical systems. If all Celtic peoples shared common origins, why was the name, British, applied exclusively to the inhabitants of the main island? Why did related Celtic groups maintain different designations? This question leads to an even more complex web of identity formation. The British designation was geographically limited to inhabitants of the main island, while related groups maintained separate identities with profound cultural implications. Continental Celtic populations were known as Gauls or Gallic peoples. There's an intriguing possible connection between these groups and the Galatians mentioned in biblical texts. Meanwhile, Hibernian, or Irish, identity developed separately, preserving pure Celtic heritage. Caledonian, Scottish, peoples adopted the Gael designation, which linguistically connects to the Gaul terminology. These distinctions weren't merely linguistic curiosities but reflected meaningful cultural differences that persisted despite geographical proximity. The collective terminology for these islands has its own fascinating evolution. Early sources used Britannic Isles, which later evolved into British Isles during the political unification under James I in the early 17th century. The designation, Great Britain, emerged from specific later historical circumstances. What's particularly interesting is how distinctly English identity developed within this framework. The term, English, itself has its own journey, and its relationship with broader British identity has ebbed and flowed throughout history, sometimes in harmonious integration and other times in tension. Successive migrations further complicated this identity landscape. The Anglo-Saxon arrival in 426 CE, the Norman conquest, and numerous smaller population movements didn't simply replace existing identities but created layers of cultural integration. But beneath these apparent differences lie underlying racial unity among British peoples. Celtic, Saxon, and Scandinavian stocks represented branches of a unified racial group, with tribal distinctions occurring within this common framework. This perspective reconceptualizes historical invasions as a form of racial convergence, almost as if Britain was destined to be the homeland where these scattered tribal groups would eventually reunite. The integration of diverse tribal elements while retaining distinctive characteristics within a unified whole allowed for the development of a shared national character that came to be recognized globally as distinctly British. This balancing act between unity and diversity would become a hallmark of British cultural identity. The story of the Cimmerians and their transformation reveals a remarkable synthesis of multiple heritage streams. This isn't just ancient history, it's the foundation upon which modern British identity was built. The British identity that would later spread across a global empire began as the story of people who themselves were migrants and identity shifters. The next time someone hears the word British, they might remember they're hearing an echo of an ancient Hebrew phrase that once meant covenant people, a testament to the enduring power of how societies name themselves and the profound meanings those names can carry across centuries. The historical record suggests that the Cimmerians didn't vanish, they transformed. They became the foundation of what would later be called the British people. Their religious practices influenced the development of pre-Christian and later Christian traditions on the islands. Their willingness to adopt new identities while maintaining cultural continuity set a pattern that would define British adaptability for centuries to come. Archaeological discoveries continue to uncover evidence of these ancient connections. Stone monuments, burial practices, and ritual objects tell a story of cultural continuity that spans thousands of years. The physical record supports what linguistic evidence suggests, that the British people's origins are more complex and more fascinating than conventional history often acknowledges. The story of the Cimmerians challenges conventional understanding of British origins. It suggests that what appears to be a straightforward national identity is actually layers of cultural identities written one atop another, with traces of the original still visible to those who know where to look. As archaeological techniques advance and linguistic research deepens, scholars continue to uncover new evidence of these ancient connections. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources. I hope you enjoyed this forgotten biblical story. Leave a like, comment, share and subscribe. This is very helpful. Join me next time for another lost story of our biblical history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.